Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey, and one of the things I get a lot when I conversate with individuals and I get into some of the things I've done, I hear you've done so much in such a short time. You've lived so much life in such a short time, such a unique and broad range of things from chemical production to railroad operations to nuclear operations to podcasting. And I just tell them that life is crazy. And today I am here with a man very similar. Looking through his bio, I saw that he's been a bartender, personal trainer, salesman. There's the word military in there. There's the word divorce, and then there's traumatic childhood, right? And so we both know, he and I, as podcast hosts and guests, you'll find out that we're going to get into quite the amount of storytelling today here. And it's true, life is crazy, but crazy has a connotation of being bad. Usually when they say, "Oh, that person is crazy," it's a connotation of negativity. But when life is crazy, it's not always bad. It can be pretty chaotic. It can be stressful. It can push us to the brink of suicide in some cases. It can push us to addiction and it can break us. But what I have found, and I'm sure our guest today will share the same, is when you live so many different experiences in one life, you really become smart. You learn a lot and you are able to connect with so many more people than you would have ever been able to had you just lived that simple, not so crazy life. And so we're going to get into appreciation today, leveraging the crazy experiences of life and what to do when life is too crazy for us to handle. We are here with Mr. Brandon Held. Would you please go ahead and introduce yourself for us?
First of all, thank you for having me today. As you said, my name is Brandon Held. My podcast is called Life is Crazy, and it's really centered about everything you just said. My life has had a lot of ups and downs, and now that I'm in my 50s, it feels like it's starting to finally taper off a little bit and become more quote unquote normal. But it took me almost 50 years for that to happen. So it starts with my earliest childhood memory. I thought for the longest time was a dream or something I made up in my head. And finally, one day I approached my mom and I told her about it. And she was like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you remember that. You were 2 years old." And so, what that memory is my biological father coming into our trailer and pulling my mom out of the shower by her hair naked. And he starts beating on her and punching her and throwing her around right in front of me at 2 years old.
Wow.
And I have never met my biological father ever, except for at that age, because my mom divorced him shortly after that. And that's the one and only memory I have of this guy. And so um, that's a theme for the way the rest of my childhood went because my mother would, get with other abusers and stuff like that. But
Right.
that shaped me into being a super protective man, which is the way that I am today. I believe that started all way back then.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people have this mindset that, oh, they're too young to remember this, or it's just children, and people fail to realize that we've discussed it on the show before. Children are sponges, right? They absorb everything, and even at a young age, what I think is interesting is what we do remember from our childhood and what we don't, right? Obviously, we don't remember everything, but we do remember certain things, and I truly believe that there's a reason behind what our brain keeps. At that point, you're conscious, but not to the degree that you are as, we are right now having this conversation. But I believe that in the background, our brain is like already set on autopilot to what is important for us to know. Something like that is important for us to know, So I think it's really important for us to pay attention to those. And I always think, like, for example, I don't remember most of pre-K. I remember when I broke my arm, right? So there's certain things that stand out more than others. And so what I want to get into is, so you talk about becoming a protective man, and then you talked about your mom getting into this pattern of the same kind of similar relationships, abusive men. Did this lead ever to a confrontation between you and a stepdad or boyfriend where you ended up having to step in and protect your mom, or what was that kind of childhood dynamic like?
Not so, I was just too big of a wimp, basically. So, I grew up poor, and in doing so, I also wasn't very educated. I didn't focus on school. I grew up around alcoholism and drug abuse and, you know, bikers, and it just wasn't a good environment for a kid at all.
Right.
And so even when I became a teenager and I would watch my mom get beat and abused, I was still 6'1", but only like 155 pounds. I was scrawny. And
Right.
my stepdad, the abuser, this guy was known as a literal badass. Like he was known for going to the bar and getting in fights with three dudes at one time and taking all three of them out, right? And
Yeah.
so that lore, that fear of what he was capable of always made me feel like I can't do anything. I'm helpless here. And it was a horrible position to be in. It was a horrible way to feel. And that's why I joined the Air Force at 17. I wanted to be a cop. I wanted to be a protector, and I wanted to learn how to do that. And I wanted to do it as soon as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what was your relationship with your mother like? Did you resent her for continuing to get with these same men? Was that conversation you ever had with her, or you were just like, my mom makes her decisions, she's a grown woman and I'm her son and I have to deal with it? But like, how did that affect your relationship with her?
That's a great question. Really great question. So, when I was young, my mom was everything to me, right? Obviously, I didn't know my father. I do have a sister that's a year younger, and I have a brother that's 10 years younger, and his biological father is the one I'm referring to that would beat my mother when I was a teenager. Um, and so I always just felt sorry for her. I felt bad for her. My mom said she was abused sexually growing up, and she had me at 16. She had my sister at 17. So by the time she
Mm.
was 18, she was a single mother with two kids. And so my mom just, did a really good job of making me feel like she was helpless, that the situations that she is in, there was just nothing she could do about it. She was helpless. And I was young and dumb and naive, and I believed all that. But obviously, as I have gotten older and wiser and can get more on the outside looking in, that did cause a big rift in our relationship. I had a period of time where I didn't talk to her at all. I had cut her out of my life completely, but it was largely because when I approached her and told her these things and the things she could do to live a better life and be better for herself, instead of taking that option, she just became defensive and nasty and ugly towards
Yeah.
me, which was the first time I had ever experienced that with her. Um, and so I cut her out of my life for a little while. And then after time passed, we are back in each other's life, but it's a totally different dynamic than it was back then.
For sure. Yeah, no, I totally get that. I think it's one of those situations where you can only feel so bad to a degree, especially in the case of repeat behavior of continually making those choices when the person has been offered opportunities to escape those circumstances or to pursue something better. So I totally get that. And it sounds like you learn to love and forgive your mother, but to set boundaries and acknowledge where there needs to be accountability. And so you talk about at 17 wanting to escape, join the military to learn how to actually enact that protection that you was so instilled in you to want to have from what you went through. So, what was your experience like with the Air Force? What job did you end up getting while in the service, and how long were you in for?
So I served in the Air Force for 4 years. I was a security policeman, and I thought the Air Force was going to be my career. I had joined it with the intention of staying in the Air Force and
Yeah.
retiring. It just didn't work out that way. I worked really hard. I tried really hard to make rank and excel. And then just one day, a master sergeant kind of derailed my whole career by writing up this report, lying about this quality control QC that he said that he did on me that he didn't actually even
Mm,
perform. He just lied about it. And so it made me rethink everything about how if someone with rank and power just wants to screw you, you're really powerless. There's nothing you can do
yeah.
because they have the rank, they have the power. So that ultimately got me out of the Air Force. It made me say, I need to figure out something else with my life. And so I did end up going to college and getting a bachelor's degree in communications from there. And then after college, I ended up joining the Army for 4 years as well.
I just recall when I was in the service, one of our worst leaders was a Master Chief, and he said, quote, I have a anchor with 2 stars on it. I don't have to justify anything I do. I don't have to explain anything I do. I am just right. That's why I have this anchor of 2 stars. The power trips, the lack of accountability, and the way the military is set up is just so flawed when it comes to that idea of rank is justice. It's not. There are still people who are high ranking who can be flawed characters, morally flawed, or just making a wrong decision at that time, or maybe an unsmart decision. And we've seen it, yeah, where like I literally had a case where I heard a captain say, I believe this is wrong, but an admiral is telling me to do it, and therefore it has to be done. And a lot of the best leaders I had in the military were lower ranked because they had gone to mast for defending their sailors, taking care of their sailors, and they were the lowest ranking. It was always the nicest people, the best leaders I had were the lowest ranking because the way to get ranked was screwing over other people, kissing up or playing favorites and just hating life. And I think that you did what a lot of people in the military do, which is they saw more potential for themselves out in the civilian world where there weren't so many restraints, red tape, and so much of that toxic culture where leadership was, yeah, there's a lot of times in the military where you do feel like you're just an object or just a number, or, you know, one person can completely change your life and you have literally no say over it. Even in the cases of like, at least in the Navy, I can't speak on behalf of the other branches, but what I saw from the Navy court system was basically there is nothing. If they think you're guilty, you're guilty. Doesn't matter what evidence there is. You can push to go to court martial or civilian side court. It's a lot of work to do that. It's a long time, a long process, and they basically make you just give up before you even start. But yeah, it's like you are treated basically as like whatever they say goes, and that culture is just so bad. And I don't know if you want to input a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I will even go as far as to say that when I joined the Army, I actually had it worse than what happened to me in the Air Force. So, what happened to me in the Air Force, I was 20 years old, still trying to figure out life. I didn't have any male role models or
Mm.
anyone to turn to say, "Oh, this is what happened to me." Because, hindsight being 2020, me being an older man who has now seen a lot more and experienced a lot more, it's not the be all end all that I made it out to be at 20 years old. And that's another reason I want to put myself out there is because I want to give people advice that haven't been through it yet. I want to help people that haven't been through it yet because I wish somebody would have been able to do that for me. So just to follow that up, exactly what you were saying. When I was in the Army, my supervisor, Sergeant First Class, he was having sex with another soldier, one of my peers, one of my equals, and
Hmm.
he was
Of
and
course.
he was married with two kids, and so he ends up getting her pregnant, and then, he ends up going over to Saudi Arabia, volunteering, and 2 weeks before he was due to return, he hung himself in Saudi Arabia because I guess he thought he was hoping to die there because of the situation he had put himself into.
Wow.
But that's just talking about what kind of person he was and who I had to deal with while I was in the army because he was my supervisor for most of my career. But also, I had an incident where in the army that I got out of the army with a general under honorable conditions discharge. I didn't even get an honorable discharge because this other sergeant and I were having a sexual relationship. And so she got mad when I tried to cut it off, and she tried to write me up and get me in trouble because she outranked me. And so when I went to our leadership and said, this isn't true, she's lying, and they were like, why is she lying? What reason would she have to make this up? So I had to come out with the truth. I had to tell them the truth. And so she came out and said, yeah, we had sex, but we had sex when he was the branch NCOIC. We never had sex when he left that position and I was over him. And it was a complete and total lie. And like you were alluding to, my first sergeant, my commander just decided to believe her with no, this woman outranked me by 1 month, by 30 days. And they decided I was lying. She was telling the truth, even though I'm the one that brought out all the information in the first place. And I got demoted from sergeant back to specialist. And then I got out of the army with that general under honorable conditions discharge. So yeah, once leaderships and commanders decide whatever they decide, there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, I know. For everyone listening, great stories. David Nathanson came on the show, and he was going to be a four-star general, and the commander he replaced because she could not do her job, accused him of sexism when he had been ordered to replace her. It wasn't his choice. He didn't show up and say, "Hey, I think you're doing a bad job." He was following orders. There were times in the military where I had to give orders to people or make things happen, and they always take it personal, shoot the messenger kind of thing. But there's always higher ups pulling the strings. But the higher ups won't take responsibility for it. They won't come and say, "Hey, yeah, I told so and so to do this." No, that's not how it works. They wash their hands of it. I've
Yeah,
had plenty of leaders in the military who would just say, "Hey, you go do this and that because I don't feel like doing it, or I don't want to take the blame for it." It's especially when you're new to any command or something. You get tasked with everything, and it's just a bad time. And as far as like what you were mentioning, there's a lot of at least what I saw in the Navy was, well, it's how they feel is the truth, not what do the facts or evidence say, specifically in the case of anything related to sexual harassment, assault, whatever it may be. It's, well, how did the person feel? That's all that matters. It doesn't matter if there's all this counter evidence proving this never happened or this could never have happened. And I've seen, at least in the military, a lot of, because at least in the Navy, the way it works, from what I saw, is one of the only ways to guarantee you could change commands and have a little more say over it was if you had been sexually harassed or assaulted or XYZ. And so a lot of people were making false claims just to move their chain of command. We had an individual who had done so four times in a row, and we said, well, hey, this person has done it over and over again. Don't you see a pattern? And of course, someone super defensive and very, politically one way about it was like, well, that's because people who are sexually harassed are this times many likely to have it happen again. And our counter argument was if someone has gotten their change of command moved to somewhere better because they falsely accused someone and they got less, responsibilities as a sailor or soldier, and then it happened again and again, and every time they've done it, it's worked, then maybe there's a chance that they're going to keep doing it because it works and it's now become a tool for them to manipulate, which is awful because there are a lot of cases of sexual harassment and assault in the military that are not getting the proper treatment because of this. But now this overbranching, everything is true, everything is always true, it screws over a lot of sailors and soldiers, even in the case of there's evidence supporting that it's not true. And like you said, maybe they're not doing it to change commands. Maybe they're doing it because, in your case, they had something that they wanted and you weren't in line with that. And because of that, I've seen it in the cases of they didn't like their leadership, right? So let's accuse them of sexual harassment or assault to get them swapped out with someone else. Or, they ordered me to have watch one day when I didn't want to, and now I'm going to get revenge by falsely accusing them. It's become such a weaponized tool in the military.
Yeah, I definitely felt it when I was there. And it's such a double-edged sword talking about the
Yeah.
issues in the military because a lot of who I am is because of my 4 years in the Air Force. I was 17 to 21 years old. It
Mhm.
really, truly made me grow up and made me understand a lot of things like responsibility, hard work, dedication, so many tools I took from the military that helped me be a better man and
Yeah.
live a better life. But at the same time, like you're talking, there's a lot of things that are broken in the military that still need to be fixed. A lot of
Mhm.
old school thinking, um, you know, just I'm the type of person that whether you're a leader in the military or in the civilian world, you should treat others the way you want to be treated. That's peers, that's loved ones, that's subordinates. That's anyone, right? Sometimes the leader has to be a leader and you have to make a call that not everyone's going to like. But even you can approach that in a way that doesn't, have to be so devastating or difficult for someone to take in or do. And I just think that's where a lot of people just get it wrong. They abuse that authoritative position and
Yeah.
they don't worry about any repercussion of their behavior because they're the boss, they're in charge. And that needs to be fixed.
For sure, and I don't want to keep going down the military path because there's a lot more to your life. But what I will say is, you talk about leading and being how you want others to treat you. And what I'll say is, one of the stories I share a lot on my show and other shows is the fact that I had, a leader who said, "Y'all don't have it worse than me, so I really don't care. Unless you had it worse than me by a good amount, I really don't care because." You guys have it better than me already. Because I had came up to him and said, hey, we're standing duty day every other day, port and starboard, or sometimes three section, but we have enough manning and hours, and we could set it up where we're only doing it every 5 or 6 days, which is a huge difference from having 24-hour shift every other day to having it
Yeah.
every 5 days. That is a huge impact. And he goes, no, I don't care because I had to watch paint dry when I joined the Navy, and you guys have to stand this watch where you're just standing in front of a door for hours. I don't care. I don't care how many people we have or if we can do it. You have it better than I had it already. That's enough. And like that infuriated me. That was one of the moments where I just really hated the military. And it's like, because that's an example of like, as a leader, you want to pull people up with you, not push others down to raise yourself up. I mean, you're supposed to be making a better system in place and environment and culture than when you got there. The goal is always to leave it better. Or if you're staying there, to continually improve it, right? It's all about the next generation. It's the same as parenting, right? You want it to be better than your kids. Like I hate when parents are like, you have it so much better than me. That's the point. That means you've done a good job as a parent, right? You're supposed to be setting it up where it's better. You're supposed to be setting up your workplace where it's better. So that mentality of you don't have it worse than me, so I don't care. But if we can make things better at no cost to him, that's the worst part. It would cost him nothing. He doesn't stand the watch. He doesn't, what, he has to make the watch bill a little differently. I offer to do it for him. I mean, what more could you want? It doesn't affect you, us having life better, other than your own selfish, envious, and salty feelings. So that's one of the things I hate. And I was gonna say, I lost it. It was about the military, but I'll let you comment on that.
No, it's you're right. It's not just the military, but bad leaders create bad leaders, and it's it's more likely than not. It's I was lucky. I grew up in a bad environment in a bad situation in life. Now, I wasn't lucky for that, but I was lucky that I always had the mentality, even since I was young, to look at people that are doing wrong and making mistakes and say, I'm not going to be like that. I'm not going to make those same mistakes. Now, did I get that 100% right? No, I've still obviously made mistakes in life, and I've been under a lot of bad leaders. But I've been fortunate enough to know and take that kind of leadership and say, well, that's exactly how I'm not going to teach someone or lead someone when I get
Right.
into that position. And a lot of people just take the easy out. That's what they had to deal with. So they just do the same thing.
Yeah, the concept is I do appreciate the my parents taught me what not to do. You know, I mean that is still being taught something, although I rather have someone who is, teaching us what to do, but I get it. And I will say what you mentioned there and going back to you talked about like you don't want to just hate the military because it made you who you are and it's kind of part of you. I remember I spoke to a Marine veteran when I was joining the service, and he said that he hated it. He wouldn't do it except for one thing. He said, while he hated the military, specifically the Marines, he said the principle of discipline that he learned from it was very beneficial. He said nothing else was beneficial. He said whatever he did in the Marines did not transfer over to civilian world at all. He said, yeah, he made some, good friends who are like brothers and sisters, but he said at the end of the day, the biggest thing was the discipline and the work ethic. And I agree with that. But like you said, at the same time, is that stuff we could get outside of the military? Probably to the same degree, not necessarily, but there are plenty of lessons that I'm sure you and I learned in the military that we could have learned in the civilian world.
Maybe and maybe not. I mean, I've
It's a different life.
the only thing that comes close to the brotherhood you create in the military is the brotherhood you get from playing sports. I've never achieved that kind of brotherhood in any type of civilian job, and I've had
Mm.
several and quite a few of them, corporate type jobs. And it's a different animal than military life. And I will say that I actually absolutely loved my time in the Air Force. If I didn't only have that one negative incident that really forced me to rethink
Yeah.
everything and get out, I don't really have anything negative to say about my time in the Air Force, except for that incident and the fact that they stuck me in Minot, North Dakota. So between those two things, I really loved the Air Force. That's the truth. Now, the Army, totally different. I can't say I liked the Army even at all. I didn't like the Army. The only thing, the only two good things that came out of the Army for me were one, I got my MBA while I was in the Army, and two, it brought me to Arizona, which is where I still currently live because I love it here in Arizona.
Yeah, no, I get that. And yeah, there were certain things I like. What I will say, ladies and gentlemen, if you are a veteran and you want that feeling of that military life, get a blue collar job with 12 hours rotating shift work that has dangerous stuff. And because when I was at the chemical production plant and the railroads, I mean, it felt like I was in the military still, trust me. So you can find some semblance of it if you want. You just gotta basically you can find the worst parts of it, But I
Yeah.
agree, because I try to explain to civilians the way you just bond differently. I talk about like, you know, you have friends in the civilian world, but you don't live, eat, sleep, and breathe with them 24/7. In the military, you do for the most part, not everyone, but you do. And also just some of the stuff you go through that only y'all can relate to, it does make that closer bond. So uh, I just want to go back over. how long were you out of the Air Force before you went into the Army?
Um, Almost 9 years, about 8.5 years. And
Wow.
yeah, I didn't
Expect
think
it
I didn't think I would ever join the military again when I left the Air Force.
for sure.
It was a combination of toxic relationship. I was on my second marriage. I've been divorced 3 times. I'm on my fourth marriage now. I was on my second marriage. I met her in college. She had the face of Angelina Jolie and the body of a fitness model. And she was incredibly intelligent. She had a master's degree in chemistry with a 4.0 GPA. But the problem is that combination in the same person makes for someone who thinks the sun rises and sets on them, right? I mean, she was
Right. Yeah.
beautiful. She knew it. She was smart. She knew it. So therefore, she could never be wrong. Everything
Right.
was
Right.
had to be her way. And so I was really attracted to her, and we had this toxic magnetic relationship where we couldn't get away from each other. But I needed to get away from her because it was bad for me. She was bad for me. And my career wasn't going anywhere in Ohio, where I'm from. And I knew the only way I could really get away and start over was the same way I did it at 17, was go in the military. So um, I actually tried to become an Air Force officer first, and I got screwed over in that process. I spent 8 months with the recruiter building a package, getting interviewed and approved by a colonel, like all these things. And then this guy got orders to Germany, and then my packet just disappeared. The recruiter, no one knows what happened to my packet.
That
And
sounds so spot
yeah,
on.
so I was so pissed off about this that I literally walked out of the Air Force recruiting office across the hall into the Army recruiting office and said, "What do you guys got for me?" And I talked to them, and I was physically fit, strong, athletic, so the physical part of being in the Army didn't scare me. I was just worried about, every branch has a reputation of what they are.
Yeah.
So,
Different
so I,
culture.
yeah, so I was worried about the culture and that, and rightfully so, because it did end up being a problem for me. But that's how I ended up in the Army. It was literally not a plan at all. It was just spur of the moment kind of decision, and there I was.
And if I did the math correctly, you were going on almost 30 when that happened.
I actually turned 30 on the day of graduation from Army boot camp. That was my birthday.
Wow. Okay. So it wasn't one of those situations where they said, "Hey, you went to Air Force boot camp. You're good to just go straight in." They said you gotta, you were in. They probably said you were in the Air Force, buddy. You gotta do boot camp twice.
So yeah, that's exactly right. So if it would have been the other way around, if I had been in the Army first, the Air Force would have let me skip boot
Mm,
camp, even though I don't even really agree with that, because having gone through both boot camps, they're two very different
different.
boot camps.
Yeah.
And so the Army boot camp does not equal the Air Force boot camp. Yes, the Army boot camp is super physical and demanding on you physically, and they do have a stretch there where they try to exhaust you and make you do stressful things without sleep, sleep deprivation. But the Air Force, the whole time, to me, was just mentally demanding, so much
Mm,
more than the physical. So I actually had a harder time with Air Force boot camp than Army boot camp.
that's interesting because I remember a shipmate of mine who was talking about the Coast Guard was very or very mentally demanding. The boot camp, he said, way more than other branches. So that's interesting. And what I'll say is, did anyone at the recruiting office for the Army try to dissuade you, saying like, "Hey, pal, you were in the military once before. Why would you ever do that again?" Or did they kind of just ignore it?
Actually, they played it pretty cool. They acted like, oh, your prior service, we don't even know if we even want you because we're not really taking prior service right now. And so, I went and took the ASVAB before I was going to rejoin the Air Force. I don't like to brag. I like to be humble, but
Income and ASVAB scores.
they looked me up and saw my ASVAB scores, and I basically scored a perfect score across the board on ASVAB. And then they were like, "Oh, I think we can take you." So
Yeah.
so it changed once they saw my ASVAB scores.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say it's more of a courtesy thing. Trust me, the military is always hurting for people. So, they're not gonna be like, "Oh, okay, we're not allowed to take you your prior service." I think it's more of a courtesy thing. But
Yeah.
yeah. And then how long were you in the army for?
I also did
Yeah.
4 years.
4 years.
Even that's an I dude, I could sit here all day and tell you just crazy stories. So when I was going to join the army initially, I actually was on a 3-year contract. I was going to be in the supply chain, and I was going to go to Fort Jackson for my boot camp. And a week before I was supposed to join Army boot camp, I had sliced my hand all the way across here. I got into the tendons and everything, literally just moving my stuff into a storage so I could go to boot camp. And so when I went back to the recruiter and told him, he was like, "Well, hell, we have to scrap your whole contract. You have to start all over again." So I had to start all over, and they didn't have any more openings. So I actually became a food inspector, and I had to do a 4-year contract. And then I had to go to boot camp at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. So it completely changed my trajectory.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people would say that was very intentionally, not your intention, but just that was the path that was meant to,
Yeah,
freak accident, gets hand sliced, completely changed his career path. People would say, but hey, life is crazy. But
that's right.
shout out to your podcast. And yeah, I know we're slowly making our way there. Um, Before we get to the podcast, I do want to talk about, we've kind of brushed over it, which is your requirements to rank up your divorces. You had a couple of those. What would you say? I know you kind of mentioned some contributing factors for your one particular then wife, but for overall, would you say your marriages were negatively affected from the childhood observance of your mother's relationships, from the military lifestyle, from because there was a long period where you weren't in the military. So what was really going on with all of these marriages, including the third one as well after that? I don't know if that was after the army or during.
Yeah, I met her during the army actually. So yeah, I mean, I was just at different points in my life, still broken. I would say, we're all still working on, even at 50, trying to be a better man and a better
Yeah.
person. But I always had a fight or flight kind of personality. And so I married my first wife in the Air Force in Minot, and it was more of a marriage of convenience. It was more of a marriage of, she's in the Air Force, she's a pharmacy technician. I'm in the Air Force, I'm a cop. She
It's
lives in
a
her
BAH.
Yeah, she lives in her barracks. I live in my barracks. We're together. Screw it. Let's just get married and get this nice base housing and get
Yeah.
money to go shop at the grocery store. All that stuff that you get to do when you're married in the military. And so, during that marriage, she was just a really negative person, and she had a really negative attitude.
Mhm.
And I try to always stay positive, even no matter, what kind of shit storm is raining down on me. I'm not saying I always do, I just try. And so that that war to its end, it came to its end where I couldn't deal with it anymore. And then I just told you, so the second one, the part I didn't tell you about her was we were together for 5 years, just dating. Like
Oh, okay.
when I say dating, I don't mean like she lived in her place, I lived in my place. We were just boyfriend and girlfriend. We lived together, all that, but the discussion of marriage never came up. And then she just finally threw an ultimatum on me one day, like, you either need to marry me or get out. I'm not living like this anymore. And so I told you how we had that toxic magnetic pull. I wasn't ready to end it, so I gave in to the ultimatum, and then
Mm,
within 6 months it was over. I left. So it was a huge mistake. And then the third time I did meet her in the army, I did think she was going to be my life partner. I thought this was who I was going to die with. We had two sons together. And
wow.
12 years in, she decided she didn't want to do it anymore. And it shocked me to my core because for almost the entirety of our marriage and relationship, I heard from her regularly, "You're the love of my life. I don't know what I would do without you. My life would never be the same without you." And then, kind of from nowhere, in my opinion, she just decided she didn't want to be in it anymore. And so in that time, I also got laid off from my job the second time I had been laid off, because we haven't really talked about my career trajectory.
Yeah.
And so now I was losing my wife, my kids, and I lost my job, my career, and I was suicidal at that time. Um, and obviously I lived to be here today. And so I was still in fight or flight mode. I still hadn't completely healed or repaired or been a better man from that. And then I met my now current wife, who I realized I really do want to spend the rest of my life with her. I don't want to know what life is like without her. And for that to happen, I had to make some changes. I had to, because I grew up under the abusive environment of physical abuse, where I watched my mom get beat and hit and thrown around. I thought I literally could just say whatever I wanted out of my mouth, and I was a better man because I wasn't beating you or hitting you. So
Mm,
the bar was low because
right.
I wasn't treating someone well with words, and that was something I had to learn to be better at. I didn't know how to fight fair. That's the best way to put it. I was nasty and I was mean in fights, and that's something that I was actually started to do with my current wife, and I could see how it was really affecting her and affecting the way that she looked at me and affected our relationship. And I knew I had to stop or I was going to lose her and I was going to be divorced a fourth time. So she really is the reason that I lost that mentality and personality.
Yeah, that kind of comparing bad to worse, right? The lesser of two evils concept. So that's definitely interesting. And I think it is something very common, where it's like, you know, I'm treating you better than he was, or I'm treating you better than so and so treated so and so. I think it's an easy mentality to fall into, be
Yeah.
like, hey, there's worse. I mean, we hear a lot of parents say that, it's like, even, we had injuries and deaths on my ship, and the MCPON came and gave a speech and said, "Lower your standards. You're not living in a foxhole." He got removed for saying that because we had, set the record for suicide. But,
Yeah.
it's that kind of mentality can be very dangerous and harmful to a relationship for sure. And you kind of mentioned that we haven't really gotten into the roller coaster of a ride, career journey that you've been on that's as crazy as your life is. And it seems like from what I've heard, the two segments of military didn't really translate at all into the civilian world, if I'm understanding correctly, or they did, or what does that play into all of this?
Well, I would say the jobs themselves didn't. I mean, the characteristics and the personality development
Right, right.
that that translates, the And it also just makes you more appreciative when you do have a good situation and a good
Yeah.
atmosphere. Because I mean, I had bad leaders in the military. I have had bad leaders in corporate world. I've had bad leaders in, retail jobs. Um, so when you get a good one, it makes you appreciate that situation more,
Yeah.
and so that's one of the things that I've taken away from those different environments is really just appreciate when you have something good, because I have job hopped for a higher income, for a better, my career's been, I have been laid off twice, and those were devastating. But I've also had jobs where I had a good job, I made a good income, and I went and looked for something else so I could even make more money because it was all about the money. I was chasing the money. And then I might leave and go get more money, even maybe $20,000 a year more, but the atmosphere isn't as good and the leadership sucks. And, then all of a sudden you realize, well, maybe this money isn't worth all the extra headache and BS I put up with. So you have to consider all of those
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
No, I totally agree. And so, what are you doing right now besides the podcasting?
So I'm actually a subcontractor for the VA. And so what the VA is trying to do, which many people are probably aware of because it has cost so much money, is they're trying to overhaul their electronic healthcare record system, which the DoD
Yeah.
already did. And so I am a part of that system that's trying to help the VA transition its almost 200 locations from their old system to the new system.
Yeah. And so, what I'd like to get into for a little bit actually before we, focus in more, a lot of veterans, a lot of civilians who have their opinions. A lot of people are pretty much against the VA for a variety of reasons. We've discussed the VA on the show before, and not the best light. From now working kind of in tandem with them to some degree, has that changed your perspective? Do you have any insight that would be helpful to a lot of the negativity and hate out there towards the VA? And if
Yeah,
you
I was
don't, you're allowed to say no, they suck,
no, no,
So
no, no, no. It's a double-edged sword for me, right? Because like you
yeah,
just said, I do work with some of these people, and I at the end of the day, people are people, right? And government jobs are government jobs, right? And
yeah, yeah,
let's be honest, there's not a lot of accountability in a lot of government jobs. And that is
yeah,
a problem. That's a real issue. And the VA is no different than that. There are, of course, some good people that do good things, and they're not the norm. But I would say by and large is the norm is they show up to work and they do as little as they have to do to get through the day and collect that paycheck. And it's sad because, like you, I'm a veteran. I use the VA. That's the healthcare system I use. And I've really had to fight and push
hmm
to get seen for some of these issues that I've had with myself. And and sometimes that means for the exact same reason, going back there two, three, four times until finally someone takes you seriously or
yeah.
takes the right step. But it can be frustrating. It can be overwhelming because they should do it the first time you show up and they don't. So yeah, I know that the VA is not a good healthcare system and it needs to get better. But I also don't think taking away the money from it is going to do anything but make it worse.
Well, yeah, for sure. And like you said, people are people, and two, it's a system that's driven economically, right? We've had some episodes on my show talking about decisions by the VA that were not beneficial to the veterans, but to other organizations in tandem with the VA for economic reasons, specifically the blocking of a bill that would allow veterans, instead of going to school with a GI Bill or post 9/11 bill, to go through this business course and get startup funding to start their own business because not every veteran wants to go to college. And it always gets blocked by these big universities who are the number one recipients of the GI
Yep.
and post 9/11 bill. So, that's a different conversation. But what I want to do is focus in on, we've had a extensive conversation here, and kind of what I want to do is kind of summarize, some of the main lessons you've learned from all of this, right? We've talked about marriage, divorce, parenting, military leadership, a lot of different topics. What would you say are the most important lessons that you want to put forward or that resonate with you on a daily basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say a couple things. First and foremost, I would say your mentality, no matter what you're going through, right? Life is what you make it. Nothing is more true than that. I've been in some horrible situations. I've been screwed over by people countless times. I've been laid off a couple times, where I was literally going to be homeless if
Mm,
I didn't find a way to uh, save myself, which is not something we ever got into. But and through all that, you have to keep your head up and you have to look at life with a positive thought in that I'm going to get through this. I'm this too shall pass, right? I'm going to be fine and just stay positive and focus on the future. Now, in having said that, the way you want to do that is keep doing the right things, right? A lot, when people get down or depressed or whatever, they maybe give in to drinking and become alcoholics, or
yeah.
they start taking drugs, or even just something as simple as, becoming a chronic weed smoker, for example. All these things that can derail you from having the life that you're capable of living and capable
Mm,
of having. You can't give into that. You still have to do the right things even when it feels like the right thing isn't working for you, it isn't happening for you. When I went through my divorce and I got laid off at the same time, I was unemployed for almost 4 years. 4 years I
wow.
was. Yeah. And so I could have easily gave up on life there. I could have
Yeah.
easily stopped doing the right things because I could have just said, look at my situation, look at my circumstances.
Right.
I have every right to feel this way and be this way. Um, but that's not how I lived. I kept living, trying to become better, learn more, and I just kept persistently trying to work myself out of that situation, finding a way out of that situation. And hundreds and hundreds of job applications and things that I applied for that I never heard from anyone. I had a handful of interviews that I didn't get the job. All things that would
Right.
maybe make you want to give up, but I didn't. I just kept going. I kept driving forward. And I'm so glad I did because, as I alluded to earlier in the podcast, my life is actually finally starting to level off in my 50s, where I have a normal life where it isn't full of ups and downs. My relationship is consistent. It's not toxic. It's not either great or explosive and horrible. My income and my job is consistent. My relationship with my sons is consistent. So, there's just something great about not having the highs and lows that I don't think maybe even I could have appreciated without going through everything I've gone through.
Yeah, I want to say kind of what you said, which is that ignoring or combating that gravitation towards negative de-stressors, like you said, the smoking, the alcohol. I include, excessive sex or sleeping in that as well.
Sure.
Those
Porn.
negative de-stressors. Yeah, yeah, for sure. And so, like you said, a lot of people turn to these things to cope, and there's no benefit to it. Long term, there's just a bunch of negative effects to it, and temporarily it might take your mind off of that stuff. But there's a lot of positive de-stressors that you can do that will help you not only de-stress but to also reap benefits from it, that aren't even related to the situation. And like you said, there it all works out. It's just sometimes so many people get focused too much on short-term thinking when it comes to people are bad at thinking long term positively, and they're very good at thinking short term negatively. And you need to, I think, swap that. I think you need to think more long term about consequences for things and more positively about what can be done in the meantime. And so you're taking a lot of these lessons in your life, as well as a lot of the craziness of your life, to make your podcast. Who should go check that out? What kind of is does the episode to episode kind of look like?
Well, so that's a good question. The first 25 episodes of my podcast are the story of my life. I literally start from childhood with the 2-year-old story that I told you about today. And then I take it all the way out through the ups and downs and the highs and lows of what I've gone through. It's really raw. I don't hold anything back. I talk about everything from my suicide attempts to the great loving marriage that I have now from my wife who I met in Brazil. So um it's it's for anyone, right? It's a great story. It's for anyone who has gone through trauma or is dealing with trauma, and it shows you that you can come out the other side. And that in turn is what the rest of my podcast focuses on after the story of my life is the ability to recover from any situation and the lessons not only that I have learned, but my guests also have learned. So I'm going to focus on having a lot of guests that have a history of trauma and are either on the other side of it or are working their way through it, so
Mm,
others can identify with that and understand uh, that there is a way out. They can see a light at the end of the tunnel because it is easier to just give up and give in than it
right.
is to stay the course. That's the harder part. That's the hardest thing to do is stay the course. So that's really what I try to focus on.
Yeah, I'd like to share something for the military. We say take a hit and keep going, and that mentality can be very powerful. And there's times where you should take time to have self-care, to rest, to recover, to heal. But there's also a lot of times where we need to take a hit and keep going, and because you can overcome that. And like you said, it's a lot easier to just give up. But life isn't about being easy. It's about, what can we push through and work together with others and ourselves to get done so that we can get so much more out of life. And so we're gonna have, your show and everything, your website in the description below so people can check out your social medias, check out your podcast, give it a listen, or reach out to you to be a guest, as well as just your other profiles and information. But I want to thank you for coming on the show today. I know we kind of did a 30,000 foot overview.
Yeah.
That's because you have your own show dedicated to this
Yes.
entire story. So I thank you for that overview. And during that, what you were vulnerable with, what you were honest about, and what you were holding yourself accountable to. So I thank you for that. Like I said, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to get a much more detailed version of everything, especially there's a lot of topics we didn't get to cover or we didn't go into as much, check out the Life is Crazy podcast hosted by our guest here, Brandon Held. Reach out to him via his socials or his website. to find out more. But again, Mr. Held, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Sailing through the ocean blue, nuclear reactors my crew, guiding the ship, the stars as our guide, through the waves we ride. Jokes and laughter fill the air, on this voyage we have to share, working together, side by side, as one family we will abide. In the heart of the ship we reside, nuclear operators with pride, powering the vessel with every stride. Our mission, a source of great pride.